Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, CPMC's webinar on trauma and resilience among the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. My name is Father Dustin. I am the executive director here at Joseph House, a mission for the formerly incarcerated here in Florida. And also a board member with Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. I am joined today by Father George Williams, who is a Catholic chaplain at San Quentin Prison in San Francisco. And today we're going to kind of follow up in a way, I guess, after our conference on December 1st, which Compassion and Restored, this kind of the themes of trauma and resilience, as you may remember, for those of you that attended the conference. And for those of you, by the way, who were unable to attend the conference, you may still register to watch the conference. And we'll post a link here in the chat box shortly that you can go to register to watch the different presentations and panelists and discussions on that day, in which the theme of trauma and resilience in this ministry came up multiple times in so many different facets and perspectives. But let us begin first, as always, with prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the gift of your Son, as we are journeying through this Advent season, preparing our hearts and minds to receive Christ, the infant child. We anticipate, God, the newness of your kingdom of peace and justice. We anticipate your kingdom to be present among us as we here begin the work of building up your kingdom on earth through acts of mercy and charity, and as we continue to do the necessary work, God, of bringing about reconciliation in the human family, we pray that you would bless us this day, that you would bless all of the respective ministries and vocations present, and we pray especially, as always, that you would continue to bless our sisters and brothers that are incarcerated and those that are returning to us. We pray all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So today, what we will, and just so you know, I just saw the conference recordings are now posted in the chat box, so feel free to check that out. So today, we're going to kind of go a little bit more in depth, myself and Father George, into some of our experiences of witnessing the effects of trauma among those that we minister to in prison, whether it be on death row or in solitary confinement or in general population in prison, and then also with those that are returning back to society, and to talk a little bit more about trauma and resilience. And one of the ways that I think is helpful, and I'll do this here shortly, is to provide a kind of a vignette, a situation that I experienced where the theory of trauma, or the concept of trauma, takes on really kind of flesh and blood in the workings of accompaniment. We know that trauma, for those of us that are going inside of prisons, wherever we are, we know that trauma and the symptoms of trauma are manifold. An extensive study done in 2014 found that 30 to 60% of men in state prisons had post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And that is compared to about 6% for the general male population. And my guess is that that number of 30 to 60%, 60%, that it's probably also much more, much beyond the higher than the 60% in that study. But nonetheless, it demonstrates that this is a pretty massive public health crisis. Most people entering prison, we also know, have experienced a legacy of victimization, oftentimes as children, that puts them at higher risk for trauma-related symptoms, but also for substance abuse and aggressive, violent behavior. Oftentimes, these are the common responses to trauma. Rather than providing treatment or rehabilitation for those that are exhibiting symptoms of trauma, oftentimes the criminal justice system really perpetuates these cycles of violence, oftentimes by the conditions in which men and women are incarcerated, but also just the sheer fact of so many prisons, so many jails, oftentimes are incredibly dangerous. The stories that I've heard, too many to count, frankly, of men that have been eating at lunch, and then all of a sudden a fight breaks out, and then there is a person bleeding on the floor next to them, witnessing something that I've seen and heard stories more recently of men watching other men overdose on Molly or K2 in these facilities. And so the exposure to trauma and violence, we know, is rampant within these prisons. In this particular study on trauma among the incarcerated, the witnesses behind bars that speak of their own experiences speak of and oftentimes talk in such a way that it is clear that they're experiencing extreme anxiety, depression, hypersensitivity, hypervigilance, flashbacks, and so many other acts of kind of emotional distress. Participants describe oftentimes these flashbacks and being hypervigilant even once they have released. And I'll share a story about that a little bit more here in just a second. One participant in the study that was done in 2014 on trauma in among those that are incarcerated explained that I'm trying to change my life and my thinking, quote, but violence always pops up. I get flashbacks about it, just how the violence is. In a split second, you can be cool, and then the next thing you know, there's people getting stabbed or fights break out over nothing. Then we will also talk about yet this extraordinary capacity that we have as human beings of resilience. And resilience can be defined in so many different ways, but certainly the ability to bounce back from adversity, misfortune, failure, conflict. The conflicts of trauma oftentimes also can almost exhibit simultaneously this extraordinary capacity of resilience. The concept of resilience stems from the belief that we as individuals have the capacity to persevere and even to grow from harsh experiences. That being said, resilience is also complex, and individuals can be more resilient at one point of their lives and then less during another point. To support and to cultivate an environment for resilience requires oftentimes creating spaces where there is a great sense of emotional safety and openness. And in terms of incarceration, creating this space oftentimes through the type of accompaniment that so many of us provide allows for those that are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated to engage in their own capacity to trust and also to grow from their experiences. So what I'd like to do now is provide a vignette, a kind of a situation that I experienced with a gentleman named Lamar. And my journey with Lamar began shortly after he was released from Florida State Prison. I think at the point of release, he had done about 7 years in prison, but actually multiple years prior to that in the criminal justice system, starting when he was, I think, 12 years old. The last 3 years of his 7-year bid was in confinement, in solitary confinement at Florida State Prison. And immediately upon release, Lamar was very open about his exposure to violence, the things that he saw in prison on a daily basis, especially gang violence there at Florida State Prison. So basically, myself and our social worker here at Joseph House went to Florida State Prison to pick up Lamar immediately as he was being released from solitary confinement. We picked him up and then drove him back to Tallahassee to here at Joseph House. And in those first days with Lamar at Joseph House, I would say he was demonstrating exceptional resilience in the midst of the aftermath of being released from incarceration, which is not uncommon. Oftentimes, my experience is people, when they're released, there's this exuberance, this kind of obvious excitement to being back out, especially if they're given an opportunity to really dream. And Lamar was no different. This is a man who could quote the encyclopedia's entry in the Encyclopedia of Einstein's Theory of Relativity. He could rattle off every president and vice president of the United States from Washington to Joe Biden, and just an exceptional memory. And I was thinking he was going to probably start off by going to the local college here, but he quickly opted for going into landscaping, becoming a master gardener. Lamar, oftentimes, though, in those early days, I would kind of catch him just staring off into oblivion at times, that kind of very far away stare. And sometimes he would kind of look back over at me as I was looking at him, and he would kind of demonstrated this kind of hypersensitivity as he would immediately ask me what I was thinking. And he would say, "Are you thinking something bad about me?" That kind of immediate association that someone looking at him was potentially a threat or would be foreboding, rather than simply looking and in a way that might demonstrate compassion or tenderness. Lamar, over this period of time, I would say was someone that my experience was quick to anger. Whenever he would experience something as being slightly off or something not quite right, perhaps it would be a misplaced date on an application or a slight inconsistency from me of a timeline. Maybe I said we were going to go shopping at 5 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. rolls around and we still haven't gone shopping. And Lamar would kind of go off in a way that was not necessarily out of the ordinary, but it was out of the ordinary enough that it made me think kind of what was going on under the surface for him to be so quick to anger. The frustrations that he would have. There was one particular night, and this is, to me, kind of was a revelatory moment in the extent of this young man's, the trauma that he was carrying within himself. And he one night came to my door here at Joseph House, and it was a night shortly after Christmas, and he knocked on the door and said, Father Dustin. And I remember hearing him when he called my name, and immediately it had that kind of that tone that I knew that something was not right, that the world for Lamar was burning, and he needed answers. He said to me, I opened the door, and then he said, don't you know, Father, that one screw up on these timesheets and I go back to prison because these numbers are not adding up and they will violate me. Lamar stands angrily over me with his community service hours log sheet in hand as I'm sitting at my computer desk. And the community login sheet was something that we would fill out for Lamar and then turn it in every month at the county jail, or the county courthouse, I should say. And Lamar immediately responded that this isn't a joke and that you can't play with the courts, Father Dustin. It was lost on me in that moment what exactly was going on for Lamar, but it dawned on me that we're turning in these login sheets at the Leon County Courthouse, which was precisely the courthouse that sent Lamar into prison for 7 years. And Lamar is perhaps not wrongly thinking me turning in these log sheets with some dates that were slightly off was jeopardizing his freedom, and that he could end up violating probation and being sent right back into the prison. So Lamar goes on to telling me how wrong I am and what grievous acts I have just done and how I am jeopardizing his freedom. He looks at me into my eyes with that cold that cold stare, his eyes effectively communicating the contempt that he feels. This apparent mistake on my part justified for Lamar that we were not taking his freedom serious. That in a way we were kind of causing him a sense of precariousness. And I hear him saying that, Father Dustin, you are no longer trustworthy. In fact, now you are jeopardizing my freedom. In this state of powerlessness, due to prior experiences in prison and within the criminal justice system, Lamar feels powerless. He needs clarity, he needs order, and his life doesn't need to be messed with by others. I won't lie that in that moment, I myself felt a bit of fear, as though at any minute Lamar might take a swing at me. I could tell that his sense of precariousness, of powerlessness, and then the anger and the contempt that he was demonstrating, it could easily kind of play out into kind of erupting in physical violence. And in that moment, I simply asked Lamar to turn down the volume. And he would have none of it. He began to utter a few expletives and then walked off. But as he walked off, I thought to myself, I kind of went back to my computer and I started thinking about Lamar and some of the things that he had already told me. What I didn't think about in that moment, in that exchange, that brief exchange with Lamar, was how he had sat in the county jail for over a year before going to prison, and that he had no mother, no father that was visiting him for that year. No one appeared to care. He broke water pipes in the county jail. In fact, he flooded an entire floor in the county jail. And he spat and cursed on the officers. And all of this was a way for him trying to give voice to the fear that he himself felt and experienced. As I thought more, just one, and this is to me something about trauma and what we experience when we know someone that has been traumatized in some way is that on the surface, it may seem that someone is simply angry or they are simply depressed. But if you kind of give it a little bit of time and wait for something to maybe surface, maybe even prior conversations that had come up, experiences that had come up, eventually you will come to witness and see exactly what the experience, what their experience of violence that they themselves have suffered, that they are now exhibiting these types of symptoms. And one such conversation happened shortly after this with Lamar. One day, or that actually it was the following day, Lamar was talking to me about how he does not want to go back to prison, but that he felt the gang life was kind of, this life of the streets was kind of calling him back. In that conversation, Lamar went on to talk to me about how he had been having these nightmares. Every night he would have the same nightmare. And he told me, he said, I had this nightmare in prison multiple times as well. He said, I've been having the same dream again. He said, there are these demons, and they be coming out of the woods in the back of the home that I grew up in when I was a child. These creatures have been invading my sleep. So I asked him to talk to me a little bit more about this house that he was describing and the woods that were behind the house. And Lamar again does this kind of dead, kind of distant stare off into the oblivion. And then he clearly was kind of replaying this dream in his mind's eye. And he said, well, yeah, there were these woods back there, and that's where my pets were buried. Lamar sits at the dining room table that evening, and he told me that his grandfather used to punish him when bad reports were being delivered from his school. He said, yeah, these things could get pretty bad at home. And then Lamar continues. He said, so when I would get home, my pop would give me the gun, and he'd tell me to go shoot one of my dogs. And there I'd grab the dog and I would shoot it point blank, right in the head, Father Dustin. And then I'd have to go and bury my pet in those woods. These were my dogs, Father Dustin. I was stunned when Lamar told me that. And in fact, at that point, it was probably ranked as one of the worst things I've ever heard. A 10-year-old kid having to shoot his own pet dogs, not just once, not just twice, but a couple of times, 3, 4, 5 times. I responded, I said, Lamar, this is awful. I am so sorry. And then he immediately said, don't be. He said, that's when I became a man. He told me how from those experiences, his connection to the gang life began shortly after the last time he had to shoot one of the pets, one of his dogs, and how someone there, and one of the big kids on the block there, kind of told him to start taking it like a man, and that there was more things that he could do that was worth his time and were valuable. And that began about a 10-year career in gang life. When going back briefly here, just to that December night, after about an hour or so of thinking about Lamar, thinking about him in the county jail, thinking about him in the courthouse, I went back to his door at Joseph House. I knocked on his door, and he opened the door, and he just looked at me. And probably 3, 4, 5 seconds passed. And Lamar then said, I love you, Father Dustin. He said, I want us to talk about this. And there for me was this capacity of resilience for a man who, up to that point, may have had very minimal adult mutual conversations regarding his needs. And in that moment, Lamar began to kind of open up about how my misplacing these dates on his community login sheet, how that made him feel and how he felt the danger that it put him in. In that conversation, I could sense the kind of reciprocity happening, like levers and wheels of a machine kind of turning and pulling this kind of dynamic of a cycle that in a way was generating a kind of power to our conversation, a power of mutuality, of a shared experience. It's collaboration that Lamar needed, and he was wanting me to work with him. He needs to feel that not only I, but that others were working with him. And in that conversation, I noted in this experience that it wasn't that I needed Lamar to tell me that he was sorry, or that Lamar in the end didn't necessarily want to hear me say that I'm sorry. What he was really wanting was to see that someone would maybe hear his trauma, to take his needs serious, because it was shortly after that encounter that Lamar opened up probably one of the most, if not the most significant experience in his entire life that determined his adult life in gangs and then in being incarcerated. That exposure to violence at such a young age and the violence that he inflicted on his pets, not an insignificant experience. And that followed him. And then I think once he got a sense that I was taking his needs serious and that we could talk about things and I didn't just have to yell back at him, to tell him to be quiet, but rather we could have a conversation about it. In that moment, to me, that is a kind of resilience, this capacity now to trust and to see if one can work things out together. So that's a small vignette, but I think to me, what I've come to find is that when I think about trauma and I think about resilience, what I think about is relationships, because it's going to be the capacity for people to have a relationship, to trust somebody else, for them to be able to share their traumas with us. And in sharing their traumas, to me, that's where I've discovered a remarkable capacity to resilience, to being able to grow from those experiences through the means of a relationship. So I'm going to end there for that for now. And at this point, Father George, I'd like to bring you to the conversation to share some of your thoughts on trauma and resiliency.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. And thank you for sort of setting the context for this topic, because in order for us to really talk about caring for ourselves, preventing burnout, increasing resilience, we have to recognize the reality of trauma, especially in the people that we're working with. So there are so many thousands, tens of thousands of Lamars out there. And for them, and their stories can be really incredibly tragic, as the one you just described. But we, as ministers walking into these institutions where these Lamars are living, have to be aware of who we're dealing with and what they're dealing with, because we can come in there with all kinds of. I'm going to come in there and talk about the Bible, talk about Jesus. That's nice, but we're talking about people who are deeply, deeply wounded. And the trouble is that we're also working in an environment, in a system that is wounding. So whilst 30 to 60% of the men and women who arrive in jail are already experiencing trauma in their lives, they continue to be traumatized while they're in prison. And that's just the reality of what the world we're working in. Also, it's important for us to realize that not only are they experiencing trauma, but everybody who steps through the front door of that jail or prison is experiencing trauma in a different way. That includes the correction officers, who have to deal with the same kind of threats of violence all the time and this very stressful environment to work in. And perhaps most importantly for us, for you are the ones who are being affected and you're experiencing trauma. And even if it's not, someone like Lamar doesn't have to tell you a story, a horrible story, like he had to endure killing his pets. But you're dealing with him day to day as he's processing his own life, his experiences through the lens of a horrible traumatic experience as a child. So it's so important that we realize as prison ministers who we're dealing with and what they're dealing with. And then also on top of that, as we're working in this traumatizing environment, we have to remember that even if we're not experiencing direct violence, direct threats, just being around people who are traumatized is traumatizing. And it's called secondary or vicarious traumatization. And it's a reality of the work we live in, the reality of the places we work in. And so to be aware of that is the first step in order to start building a process of self-care and preventing the onset of violence, or I should say, delaying the onset of burnout. Because unfortunately, in this line of work, it's not if burnout will happen; it's when. And related to that, of course, is something called compassion fatigue, which, when you're in a helping ministry, after a while, you're dealing with so much pain that as a human being, we only have the capacity for so much, and we can get kind of emotionally burned out. And that can be one way of looking at that is compassion fatigue. A good way to learn about that particular issue, as well as burnout, is to go to Dr. Katerina Spinaris's website, Desert Waters Correctional Ministries, and we can put the link up on the chat. They do a lot of work, especially with staff in prison. And as you know, I did my doctoral work in criminology, and I studied prison staff. I was interested in how can we help them, because if I was noticing in the years that I was working with the prisoners that the staff had a lot of problems, and sometimes they'd come to me, sometimes they wouldn't, but in one way or another they would manifest their problems to me. And so I slowly began to realize, well, if we really want to help prisoners, we're going to have to start helping the people who are guarding them. And so this particular Desert Waters Ministry does a great job at providing resources for correctional officers and their families, but by extension, us as well, because while we may not be going there as correction officers, we're not prisoners either. You know, we're going in there in a professional or paraprofessional capacity as ministers, working with people who are experiencing daily trauma and who are coming into that with life experiences of traumas that we can barely imagine. So having said all that, and with Dennis's great example of Lamar, how do we then take care of ourselves? How do we put off the effects of burnout as long as we can? And how do we develop resilience? Well, first of all, is recognizing, like I said, recognizing the reality of what we're up against as we're going into this line of work, that trauma is real and that we're affected by it constantly, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So that sort of self-awareness of the situation is important. I guess probably the best way to look at this is in terms of self-care. Look at it in three stages. When we're walking into the prison or jail, we're kind of being attacked physically, mentally, and spiritually. The physical environment is grim. The senses that we're getting, the impressions that we're getting can affect the way we think, the way we react in a negative way. And also spiritually, it affects us. So I think if you see this problem of trauma as affecting us body, mind, and spirit, then the way to address it is to take care of those things, and not necessarily in that order. But self-care requires us to take care of our physical bodies. If this is especially true if you notice among the people who work in prison for a long time, they might start out being very healthy, athletic, buff when they come in, and after 10 years, they're overweight. They're dealing with all kinds of medical issues and stress. We have to take care of our bodies if we're going to walk into this environment, because we're not immune to the traumatic effects of prison and the negative experiences and all of that comes with it being in there. So taking care of yourself physically, walking, exercising, whatever works for you. Doesn't have to be, you're not trying out for the Olympics, but you want to make sure that you're in shape. Mentally, I think, we have to be sure that we are processing what we're experiencing. For example, a story like Dennis related about Lamar, I mean, that's going to stay with us for a while. We need to talk about it with people, with friends, family members, a therapist, a spiritual director, because we have to process all the pain that we're hearing as well. We're not somehow immune to this, and we can't pray it away. Having said that, however, we do need to take care of ourselves, perhaps most of all spiritually, because I think the ultimate problem in prison is a spiritual problem. It's a problem of indifference in our society, a lack of love, a lack of care, a lack of compassion, and the prison simply manifests what we've created as a society, the choices we made as a society, how to treat people who are suffering, and basically, as Sister Helen said last week, we've chosen to throw people away. What does that do to our spirit? So we need to be praying. We need to have a relationship with God as we understand God. We need to be involved in a community of some sort. We're not individual entities out there in space. We're human beings are social, and so we need other people, other believers, other people of faith to support us and to be with. So praying on a daily basis, praying with people, also having a spiritual director, reading scripture, lives of the saints, whatever it is that inspires you and gives you a sense of connectedness, because the three things that help us develop resilience are related to what I just mentioned in terms of self-care. In order to be resilient, we have to have a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. We have to have a sense of connection in our lives, and we need a positive outlook. That's how we maintain ourselves year after year, working in these dreadful environments that we created in our prisons. So, how do you create meaning? Well, to some degree, you're doing it by the work you're doing. The work we're doing is very meaningful to us, to the people we're reaching out to try to help. So it gives us a sense of accomplishment, of caring, compassion. And also, we're not doing this just for ourselves. If we were, that'd be a problem. But we engage in ministry out of a sense of service to God, to our fellow man, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so that's where we find our purpose. And it's important that we keep coming back to that in our prayer and our spirituality, of reaffirming what it is, what's at the core of our existence as human beings that makes us want to go out of compassion, serve these men and women who are suffering. The connection, again, is something that comes from community, from our faith traditions. It comes from our churches, prayer groups, however you choose to connect with people of faith is important. And having a positive outlook. We are really the counter narrative to the prison system that says these are bad people, these are not even people, these are bad things that we need to get out of society and throw away. And our whole message is that every human being in that prison is made in the image and likeness of God and has intrinsic value and dignity. And we're there to witness to their dignity as human beings against all of the narrative that they're getting and against all of the stuff they got before they went to prison, the negative, horrible things that were said to them, the things that were done to them, such as what happened to Lamar. Our job is to, and not be Pollyannish about it. We can't fake optimism. But if we really own our faith and realize who we are in relation to God, then we're going to come into this work with a sense of purpose and connection and hope. And that's really ultimately what we need to give to the men and women in prison, is the opportunity to continue hoping, often in the light of what seems like hopeless situations. So those are kind of the main things I wanted to say in terms of taking care of ourselves in order to prevent burnout, maintain resilience, and deal with the stress and the trauma of daily life in prison. There's a lot of resources out there. I noticed Mike Carrata is on here, and he did a lot of work with us a few years ago on trauma, and the American Bible Society created a great training package for ministers to use scripture and work with people in prison who are experiencing trauma. That's one thing. We also have our own trauma series in CPMC that we will be putting up some links for that, and we have some trainings coming up in the near future. We got a number of webinars, and also I would bring to you, if you didn't attend our conference 2 weeks ago, you still, as Father Justin said, you still have the opportunity to watch some of the sessions, and you can register for it, and it'll cost you $30. That's what the original registration fee was, but it'd be well worth it if you're doing this in any kind of a regular way, this kind of work. I'd especially pay attention to the presentation on trauma and resilience that was presented by Bishop Walk and Dr. Kelly Watts. It was a very moving meeting, panel, and she, of course, comes to this as a psychologist and also as a person whose mother was murdered, and so she's a family member of a murder victim, and her whole process about forgiveness and healing it's absolutely worth attending, and I think paying attention to. So I would encourage you to go look at that, our website, and it's kind of on you. You're going into this work as a minister or a volunteer. You need to take care of yourself. No one's going to do it for you, and so that's why it's important to become aware of what the situation is, the environment you're working in, the hazards of working in these traumatizing environments, and being aware also of where you can find the resources and the support to maintain your equilibrium so you don't burn out quickly, so you don't develop compassion fatigue, you don't become physically or spiritually sick as a result of the things that you're seeing and hearing. Now, of course, it's also not, the reality of the prisons is negative and traumatizing, but it's not all that. There are also many opportunities in prison to experience joy, to experience the best of the human condition, the resilience of the men and women you work with. It's there. They've survived incredible difficulties in their lives, and I'm just often speechless with admiration for the way that some of the men that I work with at San Quentin have made meaning out of their lives in what seems like hopeless situations, and are really doing the kind of work in a way they're ministering to us. And so without going in to get your emotional needs met, it's okay to let the men and women there minister to you in the sense of giving you hope and giving you courage in order to keep coming back in, and also to work on some of the issues outside of prison that we as ministers who can come in and out of prison, we're in a unique position to do that. We can actually work, and we do this with CPMC and the Catholic Mobilizing Network, advocacy on behalf of the men and women who don't have a voice. We need to be their voice because, like I said, the prison system is based on spiritual problems, but it's also a political problem. It's a result of choices that have been made, and we as the culture can make other choices, but they're not going to happen if we don't step in and help on the political side to make these changes happen. So that's kind of all I really want to say. I'd be curious to see if we have some questions or comments in the chat that we can attend to. Okay, somebody wrote, I'd be interested in hearing what narrative you tell yourself about being a prison minister to enhance your resilience. I think that's going to be, each one of us will have our own story that we bring into the prison. For me, the experience of, I go into prison because that's where I see the face of Christ, and that's what gives me hope and gives me strength. And sometimes I see the face of the evil spirit too, but most of the time, what I'm experiencing is light, not darkness in the prison. I think, and that's what we also have to be aware of, that we're going into dark places, but we don't have to allow the darkness to take over. We have light. The light's already in there in the men and women. So we bear witness to the light in these dark places as prison ministers. And so that, I say, the light and the face of Christ are what give me that a sense of resilience. And every now and then I have to step back and do a timeout because it's intense. And again, We're all human. We have limitations. We have to take care of ourselves, and that's not being selfish. It's being sane. So, Dustin, do you have any other questions there? Perhaps somebody might you want to address one of them?
Yeah. So let's see. There was one here. The different. This the one that, let's see, that, well, you said you already answered the one about the narrative, right? That you tell yourself
Mm-hmm.
about being a prison minister. Uh, and going back up here a little bit, how, let's see, there's one question here. How long does one stay as a corrections officer? I guess, George, what has been your average experience of the career of a correctional officer?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, sometimes people go in there and they realize right away that this isn't for me and they leave. But my experience is that the people that I work with are actually very professional and they love their work and they stay for 20, 25, 30 years. And you see how the successful correction officers are people who have learned to take care of themselves and learned to create a balance in their lives so they don't burn out. So they're not just working to make a paycheck, do my 8 and then the gate. Because the reality is the life expectancy of COs in this country is 58 years old. So they work in environments that are extremely stressful. Um, but that doesn't mean that they can't be super professional people who find a lot of meaning in their work, a lot of community. One of the things I love about St. Quentin is that it's kind of a family. I mean, I love the COs there. I love the prisoners. It's like I go there, I feel like I'm coming home. And I think if you, to the degree you can develop relationships with the people you work with and see them as your brothers and sisters, it really helps. And I think among the COs is that sense of camaraderie that can become very kind of tribal at times, but they support one another. And so I think for us to come in, I think it's important for us to support them in whatever they're doing that's positive, and and just continue to try to encourage them to see the light in their work because I think, like I said, most of them people that I work with are in it for the duration, and we have a few people that have been there for like 30 years, and they've just the OG correction officers, and it's well worth getting to know them because they have really a wonderful perspective of many years of working in the prisons, and so they've been some of my best teachers. And they're not necessarily, you think, oh, they must be cynical. No, not at all. Some of them are actually very enlightened people. So,
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. And even with chaplains as well, even of a different tradition, what they have seen and see on a daily basis. The one thing I wanted to kind of go back to emphasize one of the practices that you were sharing in terms of self-care, being spiritual direction, counseling, and also friendship. I think, there's, I think of it in this way oftentimes, that the kind of the sorrows, the traumas, the disappointments that so many of these men just kind of pour into me. And if I just leave it there, it's fragmented and it's just painful, and it begins, you internalize it, I internalize it. It starts to lead to kinds of despair and concerns and my own kind of anxieties. But when I have found how invaluable friendship is, and I say friendship, obviously it's community, but being very specific about having people that you are able to share with these experiences, to talk with them as someone whom you trust, who's a confidant, and who knows you, and being able to kind of, because there's something about these narrating these traumas, kind of the situation I tried to do with Lamar was, rather than just taking it as a sheer experience, to create it a story that I could then share with a close friend, a spiritual director, both which I find to be invaluable in this work. And I frankly, honestly, Father George, I don't know how anyone could do prison ministry on a weekly basis and not have a spiritual director. I mean, I don't, I don't think any of us are holy enough to avoid having a spiritual director.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. Um, the other something I'm thinking before we finish, along the lines of self-care and this sense of having connections in community, is some of the things around centering prayer and our Lenten programs coming up for CPMC would be good resources for you to work to take care of yourself spiritually. I say, first of all, if you don't have a spiritual director and you're doing prison ministry more than one day a week, then get out there and get a spiritual director, because otherwise you're we're up against things that are much bigger than we are. We can't fight them on our own. So you need spiritual battle. So you need support. But I think we'll put some slides up toward the end with some of our upcoming programs. Now, I know we're in Advent. Christmas hasn't come yet, but Lent comes really, really early this year. And it's like Groundhog's Day or Ash Wednesday or something. And so we'll just having caught our breath after Christmas. It'll be Lent already. The good news, though, is that we have a great program in CPMC for during Lent that you can use for your own spiritual journey during that time. And so at some point, Kara, if you will put that up. Valentine's Day is Ash Wednesday. Okay. It's about as early as it gets. So just I wanted as a heads up there, we have materials on our website that deal with all of these issues that we're discussing, but in terms of centering prayer and you'll find that on our online too. And also, if you go back, if you missed the conference last Friday, we had a whole section on centering prayer that was actually wonderful, because we had 4 men who had been returning citizens, and they shared their experiences with centering prayer in prison in Folsom Prison in California. So that's one technique of prayer, and there are many, but I would encourage you to check that out.
We have another question here. Sorry, I was just going to say, George, that someone had asked as you were talking, how would you recommend that someone find a spiritual director who understands the work that we do in prison ministry? What I hear behind that is that maybe someone has tried to find a spiritual director that really is kind of clueless with the struggles in prison ministry.
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose you could probably check and see if there's anybody in your diocese who is involved in prison ministry who could refer you to someone that they see for spiritual direction, because I've always found it personally helpful to have somebody who has been there to understand what the prisons are like, which is not to say someone who doesn't do that kind of work can't be helpful. They can. But the best place to start is with your peers, with the in your own diocese, and see who's out there. And also, we're not limited by geography anymore. You can do this by Zoom, and so there are people all around the country who would be good resources. And I think what you're actually asking is a good point. We probably need to work on a resource for CPMC to provide people who are doing this kind of spiritual direction out there, because I think that is you identify a real need. But the short answer is check with in your local diocese who's involved in the work and who they see for spiritual direction, and then it puts the onus on us to get that information on our website soon too.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. I think this is a good challenge for us to maybe look into more, how to provide spiritual directors that have prison ministry experience. And thank you, Jared. I see Jared posted a catalog of spiritual directors, catalog of spiritual directors from a Jesuit resource there to definitely check out. And also perhaps Cheryl, I think, you were the one that asked the question. So maybe follow back up with us in the next couple of months or so, and we may have created a kind of catalog ourselves for spiritual directors.
Yeah. And I would say in the meantime, if you can't find somebody who kind of fits all those things, like somebody who worked in prison or whatever, don't, any person who is doing spiritual director who is trained to do it and is a prayerful person can be helpful.
Right. Yeah. I personally, my spiritual director has very limited experience in prison ministry, but is one who's quite empathic enough to be able to kind of to work with me on some of the challenges in the prisons. And at the end of the day, spiritual direction for us is ultimately a call to deeper prayer with our Lord. So Well, I know we're kind of getting up here to the end of today's webinar. Uh, and so, we'll obviously this is going to continue. These conversations will continue. Again, encourage you to check out the conference that's been sent out via link here on today's webinar for our conference that happened on December 1st, which you'll hear much more extensive conversations on trauma and resiliency. Father George, I know Father George joins me and all of us at CPMC in praying that everyone has a blessed and joyful Christmas as we celebrate the reality that God is with us. So prayers and blessings on all of your ministries and all of the people that you represent and bring into these conversations. May your Christmas be blessed this year.
Thank you.
Right, and see you in January.